Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine. Now, today, before I kind of look at what is happening on the battlefield, and there are some rather interesting things happening on the battlefield as I speak. But more importantly, I want to address the Western mainstream media in terms of how it talks about Russian military capability in terms of it engaging the Ukrainians. Now, what I mean by that is oftentimes the Ukraine is portrayed as this very weak opponent. That oftentimes the perception is that countries such as Poland, France, Germany, the United Kingdom have vastly superior militaries than what the Ukrainian military is able to field. Now, prior to 2014, that may have been the case. But after 2014, we observed the Ukrainian military greatly expand, not just in manpower, but in overall capabilities and overall readiness. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization played a major role in that development. But again, as you look at Ukraine, and again, looking at Western reporting, you would think that the Ukrainian military would be on par with something like the Baltic states, Lithuania, for instance. The reality is the Ukrainian military, especially its ground forces, were much larger than any comparable large Western European ground force. That includes France. That includes the United Kingdom. Definitely includes the Germans. The Germans have been eviscerated by its political leadership in terms of its ground forces. But you really have to look at Poland, you have to look at France, and you have to look at the United Kingdom. All three of these nations have around 80 to 100,000 personnel in their ground forces. Now look, when you look at France, when you look at the United Kingdom, yes, their air force is definitely much more capable than what the Ukrainians were able to field. I would argue that the Ukrainian air defenses were most likely more capable than what you would see in Western Europe, France, the United Kingdom. Very close to on par with those countries. But the Ukrainian ground forces were much larger, much more capable than any Western European military. The Western European, the French, the British have really been focused on counterinsurgency operations for many years. And if you look at their conventional component in terms of fighting a near-peer adversary, we throw that term around quite a bit, but Western Europe, is really designed to fight counterinsurgency operations. They have very small tank forces, very small maneuver forces. Now, if we look at the Ukrainian military at the start of the conflict, and I am pulling this information off the military balance from the International Institute of Strategic Studies. The ground forces close to the date of the Russian invasion was about 150,000 personnel. 150,000 just in the Ukrainian ground forces. Now, I haven't even got to the air mobile forces, the National Guard, which is a militarized organization, the naval infantry, none of that. So just the ground forces, without mobilized reserves, stood at about 150,000 personnel. 150,000 personnel. Their available tank force was 802 main battle tanks, 710 T-64, T-64BV, and BM, approximately 70 T-72s, 22 T-80s, 10 T-84 Oplot, and then an additional in store 143 T-80s, 530 T-72s, 588 T-64s, 20 T-55, and again, essentially over 1,000 main battle tanks in store. So about 1,800 main battle tanks the Ukrainians could either restore or had operational at the time of the Russian attack. The French and the British at any one time have less than 200 main battle tanks operational. So think about that for a second. The infantry fighting vehicles for the Ukrainians. Over 1,000 infantry fighting vehicles, 890 BMP-2s, 193 BMP-1s, and 4 BMP-3s, some BTR-3DAs, BTR-3E1s. These are the armored infantry fighting vehicles that the Ukrainians produce. Armored personnel carriers, approximately 328. 313, 215 BTR-70s, 93 BTR-80s. So again, a much larger conventional armored force than what you would see from Western European capability countries. Now let's look at the artillery. Again, much larger force when you compare and contrast Western Europe. Artillery, 1,737. 532 self-propelled artillery pieces. 238 2S1s and 235 2S2s. And 18 2S5s. And 35 2S19. Towed artillery, 515 tubes total, 75 Delta 30s, 140 152 millimeter towed, 180 2A36, 130 2A65, and 130 Delta 20s. Guns and mortars. Looking at 348. I'm sorry. The Ukrainians have so many mortars that they just don't even know at this point how many of those the Ukrainians possess. What I just quoted was multiple rocket launchers, 348. So 185 BM-21 Grads, 70 9P-140 Uragan, 75 Smerches. Surface-to-surface missile launchers, 90 9K-79 Tocha. That's a system very similar to the Iskander. It was the system before the Russian Iskander. Now, the Ukrainians have upgraded that system, and they had 90 of those launching systems with an unknown number of actual Tocha missiles that were deployed. So a significant, very large military that was also, at the time of the invasion, the time of the Russian invasion, augmented with a lot of Russian equipment. A lot of U.S. and European equipment. But again, the training. The Ukrainians were getting more training in terms of direct NATO support, in terms of real practical experience in eastern Ukraine, in Novorossiya against the Russians than any of the Western alliance. As a matter of fact, when NATO trainers would go to the Ukraine, they often found that the Ukrainians had much better knowledge about Russian operations and understanding of the Russian way of war than the actual trainers coming in and trying to teach NATO doctrine. All right, so ground force, 150,000. Now we go into the Air Force, the Ukrainian Air Force. 45,000 personnel. And their equipment is listed as follows: 37 MiG-29 Fulcrums and 34 Su-27 flankers, 14 Su-24 fencers, and 31 Su-25 frogfoots. Air defense. This is very important. This is where even the Ukrainians exceeded Western European nation states in terms of capability. They had 250 S-300, PPS and PT, SA-10 Grumble, NATO reporting. Medium range, so obviously the S-300s, the 250 S-300s are long-range air defense systems. Medium range, 72 Book M1s, NATO reporting SA-11 Gadfly. And obviously a host of air-launched systems as well. The naval infantry, the Ukrainian naval infantry, consisted of 2,000 personnel with T-64 main battle tanks and some BMP-1s. The Ukrainian high-mobility airborne troops. This is equivalent to the Russian VDV, or airborne forces. Just like the Russians, the Ukrainians have this separate force that they allocate personnel and equipment to in terms of their airborne or high mobility forces. 8,000 troops. So again, 150,000 person regular ground forces, then add another 8,000, and then an additional 2,000 from the naval infantry and the 8,000 from the high mobility forces. And those high mobility airborne forces also have tanks, armored infantry fighting vehicles allocated to that force. Next, the National Guard. Now, this is not like the National Guard in the United States. These are full-time combat units. And this force pushes 50,000 personnel. 50,000 personnel. And they are equipped with main battle tanks. They are essentially a parallel military, a parallel ground force. So again, 150,000 plus 50,000 plus 8,000 plus 1,000. We're now well over 200,000 active duty, just ground force personnel. And then finally, last but not least, the Ukrainian Border Guard, which was essentially can and is augmented into either the National Guard or the ground forces. And that force is 42,000 personnel. So by the time you add all these forces together, you're looking at the time of the Russian invasion, the Ukrainians could field over 250,000 men. Much bigger than any Western European nation state in terms of ground force capability. Now, when we compare and contrast, or better yet, when the Western media compares and contrasts, and they say, well, look, if the Russians are having this kind of difficulty with the small Ukrainian state, you have to look at the why. The Ukrainian military is larger than the ground forces. Their ground forces have the size and capability of the French and the Germans combined. You could argue that their ground forces, once the war commenced, rapidly exceeded what the French, the Germans, and even the United Kingdom currently have in terms of ground forces. So when you hear about the possibility of a direct conflict with NATO erupting, and if that would occur, if that happens, the Russians are going to try and seize control of the Baltic states. And just because Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania are NATO members, that does not mean they have a capability to resist a Russian offensive operation. The Baltic states have very small military forces. In all probability, the Russian ground forces and the Russian National Guard, if it's also deployed, the Russian Coastal Defense Forces, the Russian Naval Infantry, the Russian Airborne Forces, would rapidly take control of the Baltic states. You can't even compare the size and capability of all three Baltic states with the size and capability of the Ukrainians, which again, just the ground forces exceeded the capability of most Western European nation states. It's a fact. So I just wanted to touch on that a little bit. Again, and the reason I did this is we constantly get this comparing and contrasting of and under-reporting the capability of the Ukrainian military. The Ukrainian military, at the start of this war, was a very capable force. And at the start of this conflict, as we analyzed the two opponents, I talked about how this was going to be an incredibly tough, messy conflict. This was going to be a very tough conflict for the Russians, especially if they went all in. Especially if they went all in, which they did. And that's where we're at. Now, today, as I report, it is now being observed that Robatna, this area, if you remember, was the primary area. You can see the salient that was created here. This was the area of the much heralded Ukrainian counteroffensive that completely failed. Remember this Ukrainian counteroffensive? Remember how it was being talked about? I was in Hawaii at the time of the start of this operation. And it, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, completely failed. This was the extent. The primary success of this operation was the seizure of Robatna, a very small little village, which the Russians have now entered. And I imagine here very shortly we'll see this salient be completely reduced to a non-salient. Now, if you compare this, again, the extent of the Ukrainian counteroffensive to what's happening in other parts, such as up here near Avdiivka. Remember, this line was pushed back way out here, east of Avdiivka. The Russians broke through, destroyed the Avdiivka defenses, and are now driving west. And you can see that happening as we speak. If we go back to the deep state map, and again, this is a Ukrainian-supported map, and you can see that the Russians have broken through, and they are methodically driving right now to the north-northwest. Just one day passes. Here, check this out. 2 days. So the Ukrainians have a serious, serious problem just to the west of Avdiivka. They were never able to reestablish a defensive barrier to the west, and that is through the use of the Russian GLONASS glide bomb, GLONASS-guided glide bomb. That has prevented the Ukrainians from being able to dig in. And as the Ukrainians try to mount defensive operations, the Russians are hitting those aim points with these glide bombs. And they're smashing and obliterating any kind of resistance that the Ukrainians can establish. And again, that is having a serious impact on Ukrainian morale. In this sector, Ukrainian morale is crumbling. It's possible that Ukrainian morale is crumbling all along the front line. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens as we enter the summer months and going into late summer. The dynamics of this war could change radically in the favor of the Russians. Now, we'll have to see how much direct support the U.S. injects into this conflict, but right now, again, not looking good for the Ukrainians. Thanks for joining us today. More to come very, very soon. As always, have a good day.